Chapter 1. A Visit to the Bastille. D'Artagnan, captain of the king's musketeers, sincerely regretted having to deliver his friend Athos to prison. As their carriages drew near the Bastille's heavy gates, D'Artagnan pointed to a man just getting out of a carriage up ahead. "Look yonder, Athos!" he cried. "I will wager anything it is he." "He? Who?" asked Athos, puzzled. "It's Aramis, of all people," D'Artagnan replied. Aramis, Athos, and D'Artagnan had been friends since their days as guards in the king's musketeers. D'Artagnan still recalled his adventures with Athos, Porthos, and Aramis, the three musketeers, they called themselves. The musketeers were soldiers who guarded the King of France. Only the bravest soldiers got to be musketeers. D'Artagnan had proven his bravery years ago when he helped the three musketeers save the Queen of France from disgrace by recovering her stolen diamonds. After that, the three musketeers became the four musketeers, pledging, one for all and all for one. But that was 20 years ago, and the four friends had since gone their separate ways. Porthos had married a rich duchess, Athos had returned to his chateau, and Aramis had become a bishop of the church. Only D'Artagnan had remained with the musketeers, and was now a captain. "Aramis at the Bastille arrested?" cried Athos. "Impossible." "I did not say he is arrested," said D'Artagnan. "He is alone in his carriage. Perhaps he is here to dine with Basmux, the governor of the Bastille." "Whatever for?" Athos wondered aloud. "Let's see if we can find out," replied D'Artagnan. "Leave the talking to me, I have a plan." Then, as soon as Aramis had disappeared inside the building, D'Artagnan shouted to the guards, "To the governor." As the king's most trusted friend, D'Artagnan was accustomed to being obeyed. So, in a few minutes, he and Athos were shown into Basmux's own dining room, where the governor and Aramis were about to sit down to supper. Both men looked up in surprise at the sight of D'Artagnan and Athos. "Aramis, there," said Aramis. "By what chance are Monsieur D'Artagnan?" Sputtered Basmux, usually a pompous, talkative fellow who, for once, was at a loss for words. "Governor, have you forgotten our date?" cried D'Artagnan, pretending to look crestfallen. Basmux turned pale, then red, and finally stammered, "Certainly not. I am delighted to see you. But upon my honor I have not the slightest but I have such a poor memory." "Well, perhaps I am wrong," said D'Artagnan, turning as if to leave. No, my dear captain, do sit down, you and your friend too," invited Basmux. The last thing he wanted was to offend such a close friend of the king. "Unfortunately, I cannot stay," said D'Artagnan. "I have important business at the palace." Aramis and Basmux looked at each other and breathed a sigh of relief. They had private business to discuss, business that was not for the ears of the captain of the king's musketeers. Meanwhile, D'Artagnan winked at Athos and said, "Athos will join you, however, and I will return for dessert." Discomfort showed again on the faces of Aramis and Basmks. It seemed they were not to dine in private, after all. D'Artagnan took his prisoner aside and said softly, "Wait for me, Athos. Enjoy your supper. And don't let on that you're supposed to be dining in the dungeon instead of at the governor's table." D'Artagnan departed quickly and climbed into the carriage which had brought him, crying out to the coachman, "To the king!" and bummed the pavement. Chapter 2. D'Artagnan pleads with the king. Arriving at the palace, D'Artagnan went directly to the king's chamber. "Is it done?" inquired King Louis XIV. "Yes, sire," replied the captain of the musketeers in a grave voice. "Athos is now in the Bastille." D'Artagnan's words made the king feel uneasy at having imprisoned Athos. Yet there was no choice. Athos' son had dared to love the same young woman the king loved, and Athos had defended his son, thus incurring the king's wrath. "Did he attempt to escape?" asked the king. "Not at all," said D'Artagnan. "I tried to give him a horse to make his getaway, but he wouldn't allow it." "You betrayed me!" cried the king. "Exactly so." Louis was unsure how to respond to such bold defiance. "I warn you, you are pushing your luck," he said. "On the contrary, sire," said D'Artagnan politely. "I have come to get myself arrested too." "What? You? Of course. My friend will be lonely in the Bastille. I propose that your majesty permit me to keep him company." "Escape? Are you jesting, D'Artagnan?" cried the king, seizing a pen and paper. "Once I sign this arrest order, it is forever a life sentence. Surely that is not what you wish." "On the contrary, sire," replied the musketeer. "Mine would have to be a life sentence, for once you imposed such a punishment on me, you would never be able to look me in the face again." "Leave the room, monsieur," raged the king. "Not until I've said what I came to say," replied D'Artagnan firmly. "Sire, you must choose. Do you wish to be surrounded by soldiers or slaves? By great men or puppets? Do you wish men to serve you or to crouch before you? If you prefer cowardice, then say it, sire, and I will leave you. Then you may send me to the Bastille with my friend. That is all I have to say." The king threw himself back in his chair, livid with rage. D'Artagnan's sincerity had pierced through his heart like a sword blade. "Sire, here is my sword," continued D'Artagnan, drawing his sword from its scabbard and placing it on the table. With a sweep of his hand, the king thrust it aside and it fell to the floor. D'Artagnan's blood rose at this insult from the king. "A king may exile a soldier," he declared. "He may even condemn him to death. But he has no right to cast dishonor on his sword. My sword shall not be returned to its sheath. Henceforth, it shall have no other sheath than my own heart." D'Artagnan snatched up his sword and, with a rapid movement, placed the hilt on the floor and directed its point towards his heart. "My blood be on your head!" he cried, starting to lean on the point. The king threw his left arm around D'Artagnan's neck and, with his right hand, seized hold of the blade and returned it silently to its scabbard. Then, badly shaken, the king returned to the table and picked up a pen. He wrote a few lines, then handed the paper to D'Artagnan. "What is this paper, sire?" asked the musketeer. "An order for Monsieur D'Artagnan to set his friend at liberty immediately." D'Artagnan dropped to his knees and seized the king's hand and kissed it. Then, With neither the king nor the captain speaking another word, D'Artagnan left the chamber. D'Artagnan had promised Basmx to return in time for dessert, and he kept his word. Reaching the Bastille, D'Artagnan burst into the governor's dining room. "Forgive my absence," he cried to Aramis and Basmx. "But the truth is, my friends, that you, Aramis, a bishop of the church, have been supping with a state criminal. And you, Basmx, with your prisoner." The two men turned to stare at Athos, and Basmx soon began to tremble at having dined with a man who had fallen into disfavor with the king. "Here is the notice for his arrest and detention," continued D'Artagnan, handing an official document to Basmx. "And here, my dear governor," he added, handing over a second paper, "is the order for his release. And now, I think that it would be best for Athos to return to his own chateau." As Athos rose from the table, D'Artagnan turned to Aramis. "Perhaps you will ride back with us." "Thank you, my dear friend," said Aramis, "but I am afraid that is quite impossible. Affairs of state, you know." D'Artagnan could well believe this. Aramis Herblay had fulfilled his lifelong ambition when he left the service of the Musketeers, that of joining the church. Now, as a bishop, Aramis played an important role in the government of France. So, with keen glances that seemed to read Aramis' mind, D'Artagnan and Athos took their leave. As the door closed behind the two old friends, Aramis turned to Basmx, anxious to complete his business at the Bastille. "Now, monsieur, you may conduct me to the prisoner." A mysterious prisoner. Deep in the Bastille, Aramis approached the form of a young man stretched upon his bed. A certain air of royalty seemed to cling to the prisoner, even in such dismal quarters. Aramis bowed and sat down. "How does the Bastille agree with you?" began the bishop. "Very well," replied the prisoner. "You have need of nothing?" "No. Not your liberty?" asked Aramis. "What do you call liberty, monsieur?" asked the youth. "I call liberty the flowers, the air, light, the stars, the freedom to go wherever the nervous limbs of a 20-year-old man such as I may wish to carry me." Aramis heard the bitterness in the prisoner's words, and understood the reason for it. Therefore, he could say nothing, only let the young man continue. "Every prisoner has committed some crime for which he has been imprisoned," continued the youth. "But what crime have I committed? My conscience does not accuse me of anything." "Hear me, my son," began Aramis softly. "Do you know who your parents are? My childhood tutor used to tell me that my father and mother were dead." "He was telling you the truth," explained Aramis, "but only partly. Your father is dead. And my mother? She is dead for you," Aramis replied cryptically. "Dead for me?" whispered the young man. "Then she lives for others, does she not?" "Yes," said Aramis, his head bowed. "And I, then," cried the young man, "what am I doing here, in the dark dungeons of the Bastille?" Aramis looked long and hard at the prisoner sitting before him. If you were to be free in the outside world, it would lead to the revelation of a great secret. "My freedom reveal a secret?" asked the young man, bewildered. Aramis hesitated for several moments. "Have you ever looked into a mirror?" he asked finally. "Mirror? I have never been allowed to see a mirror," said the young man, "not even as a child." "And there are none here, I see," remarked Aramis, looking around. "They have taken precautions. They have acted wisely." "They? Who?" "Listen, my son, and I will tell you," began Aramis, "for the time has come for you to know the truth." The young man leaned forward, eager not to miss any of the bishop's words. "You know," commenced Aramis, "that the last reigning king of France was Louis XIII?" "I do," answered the prisoner. "Well, This king had long been worried that he would never have a son. And did Louis XIII die without one? No, Aramis went on. But for a long while he feared that he would be the last of his line. Then, unexpectedly, his wife, Anne of Austria, announced a happy event. And on the 5th of September, 1638, she gave birth to a son. "But what has this to do with me?" asked the prisoner. Aramis paused. "You are about to hear a story which only a few people could now tell, for it refers to a secret which is thought to be buried with the dead. Yes, on that September day, the Queen gave birth to a son. But even while the court was rejoicing over the event and the king was sitting down to a celebration feast, the Queen gave birth to a second son, twins. The midwife ran at once to the banquet room and whispered to the king what had happened. He rose and left the table. But now the happiness that had earlier shone on his face was replaced with terror. Terror because the birth of twins threatened the line of succession to the throne. You see, the king feared that one twin might dispute the claim of the other to the throne, and so start a civil war in the kingdom. A look of shocked realization spread over the prisoner's face. "Then, monsieur," he gasped, "you mean that I am—" "Yes," confirmed Aramis, "you are the son of Louis XIII. You are Philippe, the twin brother of Louis XIV, and equal heir to the throne of France." Aramis reached inside his robe and took out a miniature painting. "Here is a portrait of Louis XIV, he said, handing it to the prisoner. The young man eagerly seized the portrait and gazed at it with devouring eyes. "And now," continued Aramis, reaching inside his robe again, "here is a mirror." The likeness was startling. "Realize I have brought all the documents, all the proof of your birth," Aramis assured the dazed young man. "Consult them, satisfy yourself that you are a king's son, and here Aramis' voice rose forcefully, "and let us act." Chapter 4. Planning a Royal Party. The morning after his visit to the Bastille, D'Artagnan stopped by to visit his old friend, Porthos. He found the ex-musketeer standing beside his bed, half-dressed, and looking distressed as he surveyed a great number of fancy garments strewn all over the floor. But, at the sight of D'Artagnan in the doorway, Porthos' frown turned into a smile. "Ah, D'Artagnan! Dear friend!" he cried. "You are always welcome, and just now more than ever." "Well, Porthos!" exclaimed D'Artagnan, staring about the room. "Are you taking an inventory of your wardrobe? Here, I'll help you count them, D'Artagnan, please," pleaded Porthos. "This is no laughing matter." "Is something wrong?" asked D'Artagnan, becoming serious. "The fact is," said Porthos unhappily, "I have received an invitation to the king's party." "Splendid!" cried D'Artagnan. "I shall be there too." "Alas!" cried Porthos. "But I have nothing to wear." "Nothing to wear?" D'Artagnan inspected the room. "But I see more than 50 outfits on the floor." "50, yes," replied Porthos, "but not one that fits me." "What? Haven't you always had your clothes made to order?" "To be sure," cried Porthos. "But my manservant, Mouston, has grown stouter. Much stouter than I am." D'Artagnan was puzzled. "But what has Mouston got to do with the size of your clothes?" he asked. "Mouston has always been kind enough to take my place at the tailor's," explained Porthos. D'Artagnan tried to keep from laughing, but he could not. "Obviously, my dear Porthos," he said, chuckling, "there's nothing to do but order a new suit of clothes." "But the party in honor of the king is only 2 days away," protested Porthos. "Who will make me anything by then?" "The king's tailor, himself," cried D'Artagnan. "Come along, Porthos. We have no time to lose. D'Artagnan and Porthos hurried off to the shop of Monsieur Pissarrin, the most sought-after tailor in Paris. As they entered the workroom, the old man looked up with a smile of recognition and greeting. "The captain of the musketeers will excuse me, I am sure," said Monsieur Pissarrin, "for I am very busy." "Ah, yes," replied D'Artagnan, "on the king's clothes for the party, I presume. You are making 3 suits, they tell me." "5, my dear monsieur," protested the tailor. "5. Indeed!" cried D'Artagnan. "And I am sure they will be beautiful. But I have brought you a customer, a very good friend of mine." And D'Artagnan indicated Porthos beside him. "I will attend to monsieur," said Pissarrin, "but not until later." "Later?" cried Porthos. "When?" "Why, when I have time," replied Pissarrin. Suddenly, from behind a door leading into the fitting rooms, a new voice entered the conversation. "By no means later, Monsieur Pissarrin, if I ask you." And then Aramis stepped into view. "Good morning, D'Artagnan." "Good morning, Porthos." "Good morning, D'Artagnan." "Good morning, Porthos," exclaimed Aramis. "My dear friends, Monsieur Pissarrin will most certainly have time to make your outfit after all. Isn't that right?" added Aramis, turning to the tailor. It seemed that Aramis had an even greater influence over Pissarrin than D'Artagnan did. "Monsieur," said Pissarrin to Porthos, "if you will follow me to the back, my assistants will take your measurements." Delighted, Porthos left the room with the old man, while D'Artagnan remained with Aramis. "Are you going to the king's party too, Aramis?" asked D'Artagnan. "Yes," said Aramis with a smile, "but without a new suit." "Well, then," said D'Artagnan, "so it is not a new suit that brings you to Monsieur Pissarrin?" "No, no. That is, exclaimed D'Artagnan. "You have some private business with Pissarrin?" "I shall go away." "Some private business, yes," said Aramis, "but not private from you, D'Artagnan. Please stay and listen. We are, after all, old friends." "Yes, indeed," replied D'Artagnan, most curious now about Aramis' business, and even somewhat suspicious. Aramis turned then as the tailor returned to the room. "My dear Pissarrin," he began, "you are making 5 outfits for the king to wear, are you not?" "Monsieur le Bishop, you know everything," marveled Pissarrin. "And a great many more things too," murmured D'Artagnan. "But what you do not know," cried the tailor in triumph, "what nobody knows, is the color and style of the king's new clothes." "Well," said Aramis smoothly, "that is precisely what I have come to ask you." This request seemed so ridiculous to Pissarrin that first he laughed to himself, and then he laughed out loud. "Surely you jest," he exclaimed. "Not at all," replied Aramis. "At the party we wish to present the king with a portrait of himself. And that portrait ought to be dressed exactly as the king will be on the day it is presented." Then, turning to D'Artagnan for support, Aramis asked, "Is that not so?" "Yes, my dear Aramis," agreed D'Artagnan, "and it is a brilliant idea." D'Artagnan was willing to go along with the story for the time being, though he didn't believe a word of it. "Well, Monsieur Pissarrin," pressed Aramis, "what do you say to it?" I don't." Pissarrin hated to offend a good customer such as Aramis, but as a king's tailor, after all, he was sworn to secrecy. "You are, of course, free to refuse," said Aramis. "I shall just have to say to the king, I had intended to present your majesty with your portrait, but Monsieur Pissarrin opposed the project." "Opposed?" cried the tailor, terrified at being thought to oppose the king's pleasure. "Oh, 'tis not I who oppose it. Please, Monsieur D'Artagnan, you are my witness. Did I say no?" D'Artagnan shrugged his shoulders neutrally. "Come," said the tailor to the 2 men, and you shall see both the patterns and fabric samples. I am sure the king will be surprised to no end by your present." And under his breath D'Artagnan muttered, "Personally, I don't doubt this for a minute." Chapter 5. The prisoner makes his escape. Aramis was most annoyed at having met D'Artagnan at the tailor's, for he knew that the musketeer did not entirely believe his story about the present for the king. No, thought Aramis, D'Artagnan will not be deceived for long. And once he is onto my scheme, neither friendship nor money will buy his silence. He is completely loyal to the king. Chapter 5. Aramis, therefore, was not in a very good mood when he arrived at the Bastille for the second time in as many days, but this time he had replaced his bishop's robes with the suit, boots, and sword of a cavalier. 7 o'clock sounded from the great clock of the Bastille. 7 o'clock, the supper hour of the unfortunate prisoners, thought Aramis as he sat down to dine with Basmux. But his inner thoughts were masked by the unusually cordial smile he gave to the governor. "Monseigneur," began Basmux, calling Aramis by his official church title. "No, no," interrupted Aramis. "Call me monsieur, please," he said warmly. "I am not in bishop's dress this evening." "Monsieur, then." "I am honored to have you at my table," said Basmux as he lifted a glass of wine in toast. "Basmux," replied Aramis, "let us get tipsy together tonight." "Bravo!" applauded Basmux. "There is nothing I would like better." Which was true, for Basmux basked in the company of his superiors like a dog in the sun. As he brought in their 5th bottle of wine, a servant delivered a message. "Monsieur Basmux, an official order has arrived." Aramis cocked his ear and listened. Yes, the plan he had arranged was now being put into operation. "Leave it in the office," snapped Basmux. "Can't you see we're busy?" "Yes, monsieur, but stammered the servant. "Perhaps, my dear friend," began Aramis as he grasped the shoulder of the drunken Basmux, "perhaps it is important." "Oh, you're probably right," grumbled the governor. But when one is at supper with such an esteemed companion, Aramis bowed politely, then gestured to Basmux to read the orders. "What is it?" prodded Aramis carefully. "An order of release." "There, now," said Aramis. "That is good news, indeed, and worth disturbing us for. At 8 o'clock in the evening? I'm sure the unfortunate prisoner will forgive you." "No doubt. But the prisoner shall be set free tomorrow morning, at daybreak." "Tomorrow?" Aramis froze in fear, but he managed to hide his anxiety at the delay. "At dawn," confirmed Basmux. "Why not this evening?" asked Aramis, pretending to be puzzled. "The message says urgent." "Because this evening we are at supper," said Basmux, "and our affairs are urgent too." "Dear Basmux," said Aramis, his voice suddenly silvery and warm, "even though I wear boots and a sword tonight, at this moment I talk to you as a priest. Cut short this poor man's suffering. God will repay you in paradise." "Oh, all right," grumbled Basmux, rising to go. "I don't understand it, though. For 10 years, they tell you, watch this man well. And then all of a sudden they write, set him at liberty. And add urgent. Basmx shrugged his shoulders. The next moment, however, he stopped in his tracks. "Monsnr," said Basmx, "this order has not been countersigned. There must be 2 signatures for the release of a prisoner the king's and one other. I shall send to the palace for instructions. This could be a forgery." "You are absolutely right," agreed Aramis, thinking quickly to prevent a disruption of his plans. "But if a superior officer gives you orders, you will obey?" "Most certainly, Monsnr." "Well, Monsieur Basmx, I, too, am going to write an order, and one whose signature you cannot question." Aramis' tone was suddenly cold and firm. Basmx turned pale at this icy change in the bishop's manner. Aramis took a pen and paper from a nearby desk and wrote out a command for Basmx to carry out the order in question, signing it Ad Majorem de Gloriam, by the grace of God. Basmx did not move an inch. If the original order was indeed forged with the king's name, then he Basmx would be responsible for releasing a state criminal. But were these God's orders as well? Aramis sensed the jailers in a turmoil, and knew he had to reassure him. "Come, come, my dear Basmx," he said. "You are a simpleton. Don't worry so." Basmx finally bowed and left the room. Aramis paced nervously until the man returned, followed by the youthful prisoner whom Aramis had visited the day before. "And now, monsieur," Basmx was saying to the young man, "now that you are free, where do you intend to go?" The prisoner looked around, as if expecting someone to come up with an answer. Aramis stepped forward. "I am a man of the church, and here to render the gentleman whatever service he may please to ask." The prisoner smiled and placed his arm through that of Aramis. "Adieu, Basmx," said Aramis, and he and the young man speedily left the governor's apartment. A carriage was waiting outside for Aramis, as planned. "Go on," he said to the driver, and the carriage rattled over the pavement of the Bastille courtyard. Aramis barely breathed during the minutes it took to open all the gates at the moats. The prisoner, buried in a corner of the carriage, made no more sign of life than his companion. At length, a jolt more severe than the others announced to them that they had cleared the last moat. Behind them closed the last gate. No more walls either on the right or left. Heaven everywhere, liberty everywhere.